Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me and providing me with the possibility of being here with you all. I'm going to try and be brief, but if you will allow me, I would like to start my presentation by reflecting on the role of the National Office for Forecast and Strategy and why. We're speaking about the long-term vision we have, and we want to incorporate not only in public institutions but also in society in general terms. And it is known that we are short-term human beings. The Homo sapiens had to deal with immediate things, and that brought them to that view of the short term. And this is this view of the short term that sometimes makes us make mistakes and have to correct things in the future. States and social institutions were born to correct these short-term biases, and it is true that in the last decades we've seen a proliferation of institutions that are concerned about this. In Spain, we didn't have this tradition well established, and in fact, we've tried to provide this from the Foresight Department to see what are the future possibilities and design strategies and paths to reach that future that is positive for everyone. And in this conference, we're talking about this pathways, routes. And this is very much linked to what we're doing in our department. I'm sure you've heard about the Spain of the 2050s, and we are looking into the challenges that we will face in Spain, but in other many European economies in this horizon of 2-3 decades, and the employment we will have for 2050. I wasn't able to be here yesterday, but I was here today and looked at the program too, and I'm sure some of the things I will be saying are a repetition of what has been said before. But I would like to highlight the structural processes and the currents that are behind and underlying that help us understand what is the future. We have black swans, immediate events that happen, and we have little margin to react to them, and we do so in the best ways possible. But then we have other underlying currents that are present through time and that we can somehow forecast and analyze, and this is what we need to focus on, and we have to see what are the opportunities and challenges that we are going to have to deal with in the future. What were the structural processes that will define our future and that in fact will define our society, our economy, and our labor markets? We could highlight the three classical ones, mega trends that are part of the present-day discourse and that we've addressed more or less in the last years, and many that come from the pandemic: the technological transformation, the green transformation, and demographic aging. And there will be one left, which is the increase in most European economies of almost 30% of population in cities. Is not a minor element, but these three that you have here on the screen are probably the ones that will set the grounds for the future in different regions in Spain and in most Western economies. Sometimes we analyze each of these megatrends and its impact on employment in an isolated manner as silos, but we believe the essence is in the intersection of these three. When we analyze employment with green transition and technology transitions, we maybe forget about other elements and the synergies created between the three megatrends. And we need to understand them in a new paradigm. I say new, not only because it's recent, but because it's become more significant in the last days and that you can see here for sustainable development. How can we continue having an income, wealth and employment, respecting planet limitations and also being socially sustainable, as the title for the conference says. So we have a concept of welfare that is much broader than the traditional one, and in fact this is already something discussed in the press, the value of leisure time, mental health, physical health. So under this concept, this mindset, this perspective, we talk about the employment of the future, and it's important to bear all this in mind when we reflect on the employment of the future. Mainly because we realized that in the years of a big acceleration, when we think of in environmental terms, we've been able to generate an income, wealth, employment, but we've gone beyond the planet limitations, not always obtaining better results for society. Sometimes there are great inequalities in European economies, and this shows that this is a problem we will have to deal with in the future, and lots of this inequality has its origin in the labor market. It is common to speak about the employment of the future and of 2050, starting with technology. The technology transformation is the one that will be more disruptive. It has been so in the past and it will continue to be so in the future. But I would like to stress a figure, and that is demographic aging. Here we have the demographic pyramid for Europe. This is the average of the 27 member states of the EU. More than 30% will be more than 65 years old. In the case of Spain, more than 10% of the population from here in 3 decades will be older than 85 years old. This is a reality that with certain degree of error is something we will find, and this will be the reality we will have regarding demography in future years. If we translate this to what people will be at a working age in the labor market in Spain, this will mean a drop of 12% in the next 3 decades. This is more than 3.5 million less people. This obviously means many things if we analyze it regarding the evolution of the economy, welfare, and the creation of wealth. And this is another element we need to include when we analyze employment for the employment of the future in Spain. Obviously, technology transformation observed in the last years is going to be intensified and maintained in the next decades. There's no doubt of this. We don't know the speed, but we do know that it's going to happen. And here we have an example of how all the technological advances are being incorporated in our daily lives. It is very complex. It is more and more complex, and this will have an effect regarding skills that need to be available to be able to deal with this technology. And obviously there is a change in paradigm towards solutions that are person-centered. Technology has gone from offering a service for a specific collective to something that is linked to the specific needs of each and every one. So under this umbrella, it's obvious that automation will continue transforming and changing the dynamics of the labor market. We've seen this in the last decades, substituting some task by a robot or digital agent, and probably in the next decades we will observe that this digital transformation will mean that some of the tasks that up to now demand a certain degree of creativity can also be absorbed or carried out by a technological solution. And here I provide some examples like medical diagnosis, drafting of documents. This is a reality. The percentage of jobs that are going to be automated has a certain degree of uncertainty. We still don't know the magnitude, but we do know that this will be a process that continues to exist and that we will have to deal with in the future. Of course, this automation doesn't need that there is an increase in structural unemployment or a destruction of employment at a net level. And In fact, evidence says just the opposite. Of course, there are job positions that will disappear, and we need to be aware of this. This happens in all kinds of transition processes, and we will see this also in the green transition. But in net terms, and if we look back and we look at the evidence, we see that the results are positive. There is an improvement of efficiency, investment, and this generates new employment growth, and the effect is positive. But not only in this way, but also regarding the needs that have to do with the development of automation, because all these technologies have to be programmed, have to be developed, have to be put in place, and we could talk about metaverse and virtual reality for ages. But of course, there's a big niche of employment generation, and I insist, the experience tells us that the technology transition will not leave bad figures regarding employment in advanced economies. But this analysis of the technology transformation has to be carried out, taking into account the other two transitions, the green transition and the demographic transition, and I will go into that further on. So we will continue to face changes that have to do with technology transformation. Some of the jobs will be destroyed, but many other will be created. What's obvious is that all jobs, depending on the skilling level, will demand more skills now than in the past. And probably we will see a progressive change regarding the demands of skills in all professions. Here we have a puzzle of skills, and there is a consensus of which will be highly demanded in the future. For example, advanced cognitive skills, physical skills that are not repetitive, everything that has to do with care, and what we call soft skills. But recent surveys tell us that not only workers in companies, but the companies themselves start to give more importance when employing and when assessing their workers to this kind of skills. A higher demand of soft skills or non-regulated skills is a learning process, not only linked to a degree or a vet, but to ongoing and lifelong learning. And we have to look at the roadmaps that have to be designed, because in 3 decades we have to reflect on the kind of education that we will need at that point in time in a country like ours, and there's a big room for improvement. It is true that our daily reality has already changed things. We are now working with the digital economy, and the employment is changing, and we have a structure that maybe doesn't provide all the opportunities it should regarding quality and employability to the population. But in the future, these new options, these new formulas, these new jobs may be here to stay, and they will be implemented in a more generic way and under structures that are not linked to precariousness or to a solution that I can opt for because I cannot find a traditional full-time job. So all this reformulation of the kind of jobs, the possibility of combining different sources of income, for example, working as a freelancer, but also for a company, working remotely and not. It is true the pandemic has shown what are some of the needs, but probably in the future the reality will be different, and we have to get used to a nature of work that is completely different to the one we had in countries like ours up till now. And the question here that I will go back to when we reflect on the policies that should be adopted as big guidelines is the way that social protection networks are going to provide a response that is very much linked to long-lasting careers with medium or medium-high wages to this new paradigm and this change in reality and in the nature of work. And I guess this will change a lot. So we will have to have a new balance when taking into account these new modalities of work. Technology will be a key element for the green transition. The green transition is always analyzed in terms of employment generation on the long term. We talk about renewables or refurbishment of homes, and we think they will create jobs. We talk about precision farming, and we always talk about creation of employment, but we shouldn't be naive. There will be costs of going from one thing to the other. There's a cost in the green transition, and what I point out here is that we need to readjust employment in the different sectors. Of course, reskilling is a key element here, not only because green sectors demand skills to those that are working in the brown sectors that are very different. No, it's not so. What we need to find is the fitting of different pieces demanded by different sectors. Brown sectors are usually linked to the industrial sector, but when we think about the mobility of the future, healthy food and other elements, we think about the service sector. So this change in the demand mix on behalf of the users that is linked to the green transition means that the labor market and employment policies need to also take that into account to provide the right response. It is also important to bear this in mind, because when you see the degree of acceptation regarding skilling, depending on you being in a green or brown sector, differences are very big. Those workers in brown sectors fundamentally, but also green with low skilling, do not like measures that have to do with decarbonization and circular economy. So not only due to the success of the labor market, we need to bear in mind this, but also taking into account the degree of acceptance of the citizenship regarding all the new measures for the green transition. A segment that you probably reflected on yesterday, and that I believe in a country like this one, in some specific regions, it can change the dynamics of the labor market in future years, and that is everything that has to do with the silver economy. I started the analysis of these mega trends focusing on the demographic aging. We could have a whole session only on this, speaking about the effects of this on the labor market. But regarding challenges and also opportunities. And the silver economy talks about opportunities, and it is present everywhere, and shows many opportunities that are linked to a new paradigm, which is active aging. The fact that aging now is not like aging 2 or 3 decades back. The number of years you spend as a retired person has completely changed, and we have better health. This means that we need to change our preferences, we need to demand new services and goods, and the labor market will provide a response to this. A clear demand of this sector of the population will determine the rendering of services, but also of goods. And here I provided some examples, and I would like to illustrate it with one of them. You see that they affect absolutely everything: tourism, health, food, and all technology services that have to do with the rendering of alternative services like telemedicine, but also affecting leisure. And I would like to say that the European estimates regarding the spending in care is something that will have to be developed and strengthened in the welfare structure. Those estimates for Spain say that public spending on care could go from a 0.8% of the GDP to over more than a 2% in the next decades. And I'm only talking about the public side of things. If to this we include the rendering of services that has to do with the private initiative, then this will be a niche of opportunity that is growing. And this is just a reflection of what's happening. I would also like to insist on this idea where before a new paradigm to understand society, and aging has to also be understood in these terms not only as a challenge that is going to change our welfare state and our public accounts, but also what I've just mentioned. Basically, because in this concept of increase in life expectancy with good health, there is also something that we reflect on, and that is shown in this report on Spain for 2050, and that is how we're going to have to adapt our working cycle to our changes in our life cycle, to live longer, to have a longer life expectancy, to suffer less medical problems. How can this change our participation in the working and in work and in the economy? And I'm not talking about those that are 70 to 75, but those that are 55 to 65. And the study says that most of the population is in good health conditions. But if we look at the data of the labor market, we see that there's a big jump regarding participation in the labor market. And you can see this when compared to other European countries. There are many elements involved here that have to do with culture and businesses, and also to retirement, and there's a long-term unemployment too. But if we're able to have everything operating adequately in the future, this is one of the aspects we need to focus on. And many reflections arise from this that will affect the way in which we orient our employment policies, and that is how we're able to assess the experience, how we are able to facilitate this transition between the work and retirement, where in a few years we might have solutions like participation in specific activities, which might facilitate that this older people can have a higher participation in the labor market. This demands rethinking business culture and business spaces, and also something that has to do with ongoing learning. You cannot reach that age and say I have the skills to continue. Probably many of the skills are not there. Some are physical skills, but others can be acquired in an easy manner. And here, now, we will have a win-win situation, because we don't lose all the existing potential that sometimes we just waste, and also we will not have such low levels of employment of the age, and then we have the youth and women, but that would be something that we should address in another conference. This is a summary, and surprisingly I am doing well with time, of some of the studies that try to anticipate what are the sectors that will generate more employment in the future, and that's those that will be destroying more employment. It is true that there's no magic wand, and probably the sectorial analysis is not enough, but there seem to be some employment niche that will grow, and we will see how and for how long and when, but everything that has to do with health care and also technology. Not only a technology you have in your mind, but also technological solutions to make possible that the green transition and demographic transition are possible. And it is very difficult to have a full decarbonization process with a circular economy without technology. So technology needs also to be seen as an ally to make possible many of the changes that we see as positive regarding employment, and without this technology we wouldn't be able to achieve. So I do believe there is some consensus in technology services, leisure services and health services that can be significant employment niches for the future. This doesn't mean that when you look specifically into one sector we will see that the effects will be negative, because it will depend on how or if the companies or individuals are able to successfully navigate these big transitions that I mentioned before. So I have two big questions, and then I will give you some recommendations. I believe you've probably gone into further detail throughout these 2 days, but what I would like to do now is to talk about those big elements that need to be taken into account because when we think of employment policies. How can we provide an answer to the changes that have to do with the green transition and technology transition? I have both together, not because the answer has to be the same one, but they do have some common denominators. There is a key idea throughout the conference, and that is that we have to go towards an integrated education system through life. We need to try and have as many workers as possible that have skills that are the adequate ones for the market labor at a specific point in time. This breaks with the traditional paradigm that we're used to, and I'm going to mention some of the things that we can work on and that we should focus on and that experts agree on, and that is to have pathways in universities, VT, and so on and so forth that continue through life, that you're able also to transition between one learning formula and another, that it's more agile, and that it's something common, that the training of the population continues in an ongoing way. We have to make use of technology here. There are some programs that focus on this to be able to anticipate the needs of the production fabric, but also for the population to be aware of this and how they need to orient this to be able to have the adequate matches. It's important to have a coordination in the private sector, but in the public sector and in the private public associations. And it is also important to establish a right to learning, that a worker always has training periods without this being punished. There should be a culture that rewards you for being part of this process. Regarding the redesign of active employment policies, I think a lot more than what I could say has already been said in the conference. It is true that sometimes the problem is funding, but in other occasions it has to do with profiling, employability, training, needs, and how to respond to this changing market. And something that I didn't mention that has to do with evaluation. For the unemployed, and not only for the unemployed, for those that can suffer the transition costs of these mega trends. We need to reinforce, in some cases we're doing this correctly, but in general terms there is a recommendation of reinforcing orientation services to analyze more specifically the individual to be able to facilitate a transition from unemployment to activity. Everything else is linked to the digital economy, the way in which we need to make the most of the opportunities of hyperconnectivity to be able to progress. We need to also overcome the problems of the gender gap and of life-work balance. And then one last comment that has to do also with the digital economy, but not only with it. How do we make possible that workers, all workers in the system, and more specifically those that have a non-conventional employment, start to contribute for their real income? This is something that is being discussed, and when we think about the future, I believe this becomes more relevant. And now, and to finish, the other main element I would like to highlight is how to provide a response to the demographic transition. This is a pending issue. We need to have more participation in the labor market of those that are older, always taking into account the differences in health, the work that is carried out, the physical needs demanded. It's not one suit for all or one size for all, but there's a lot to be achieved here. And when we ask the population if they wouldn't mind continue working after retirement age, there is a percentage of the population that acknowledges that in different ways they would like to continue participating actively in the labor market. So these are formulas that are already established in other countries and work really well, and that are not being fully developed in Spain, or at least not sufficiently. To do so, we need to improve the way in which we have active retirement understood. There's a great potential there, and this should be developed in the future. And also we need to have programs to reincorporate our workers. In the context of the dialogues for the future that we are developing, and we were here in the Basque Country recently too, we talked about different recommendations, like why not a training sabbatical for those that are older that need to be reskilled so that they continue contributing to their company, or why not a senior Erasmus. These ideas might seem odd out of context, but if we develop them adequately, this can allow us to reach the objective that I mentioned. And one last aspect that I believe is significant and that I should highlight. If we think in the next 30 years, we have to see how we give value to the services sector of long-term care services. This goes through public spending, but also through training and professionalization of the network of carers. And here we have to take into account this double objective, and that is employability, but quality in this employment. So there's a big room for improvement. And finally, what we want to do is for in all of these changes to be able to generate this quality and inclusive employment, and to rethink beforehand how the welfare state and our networks have to adapt to a labor market that is going to be very different to what we've had in our country. So we need to think about protecting the individual and not the worker, something that is clearer and clearer, and in some other countries they've done a lot in this direction, and I believe this will be a key element in the future, and how we can integrate employment policies with other policies. That was everything. I know I've taken 1 more minute, and I don't know if there's time for questions. Thank you.
If anybody wants to ask any questions, you notice behind me they're changing the setup here on the stage to move on to conclusions. You spoke about immigration, Sarah, and I can imagine with the description that you've made of the situation, it's going to be inevitable and very necessary to have labor from overseas. We're in a globalized economy, and we're going to need labor. There's several options to deal with the drop in the working age population. There's a lot to be done to make more people employable. We have very low employment levels in Spain. If we could get people over the age of 55 to have similar employability levels to those in other countries, we could add 2 million people who are able to work in the future. We can also increase our productivity to keep the same income levels or improve the per capita income in the future. But something else that is a challenge when we saw looking towards 2050 is that we need to integrate populations from overseas as best as we can. This needs to be done in good conditions, but of course it's a reality that the majority of European countries share with us that have a similar challenge. I don't want to call it a problem, but they have the challenge of the aging of the population. As we said, not everything is a problem. There are opportunities out there as well. So, SARA BALIÑA, thank you. A warm hand for her.